But I think there are ways in which, as we read through Scripture, there are later stories that shed light back. And so we do have this story in chapter 32 and 33, that the story of the wrestling of the Jabbok and then the meeting with Esau on the other side. That, I think, helps. But I think there's also a story in 1 Samuel that really helps, and that's the story of Saul and David and Jonathan in particular. And as we read the story of David, we can see at many points these resemblances both to Jacob and to Esau. So there are certain episodes where it's very clearly he's like Jacob. He's the one who is the son-in-law who's resisted by his father-in-law. His father gives him the wrong daughter, not the daughter that he had promised. He mixes up the two daughters. Then we have the way in which he's the one who is connected with these key terms or times, things like the time of sheep shearing, or there is a connection with the story of Nabal and the story of Laban. Laban is Nabal backwards. And as we go through that story, we can see aspects of the story of Jacob and Laban, where Jacob is looking after the flocks of Laban and he's treated ungratefully. David has a similar situation. He and his men protect the flocks of Nabal. And then this is the time of sheep shearing. That's the time when Jacob left Laban. And Nabal treats him ungratefully, and then David goes to attack Nabal with 400 fighting men. That's exactly the number that Esau went to attack Jacob. And then just as Jacob sent out a wave of gifts to pacify Esau, so Abigail sends out a wave of gifts to pacify Jacob, in this case David. But what we have in that story is the playing out of the same themes, but David is kind of the two juxtaposed characters of Jacob and Esau are playing out in him. David is the other character in Scripture who's described as ruddy, the way that Esau is described. And then we also have the way in which Saul is compared to Esau at various points, Isaac at others, Laban at others. And so we have this sort of selection of characters that are playing out in the background. Now, in the middle of this story, there are these two episodes. And in these two episodes, it's whether David is going to get the kingdom that's at stake. It's the two stories flanking the story of Nabal in chapter 24 and 26. In both cases, there's a situation of darkness. In the first, it's the darkness of the cave. And Saul is relieving himself in the cave. David goes in and he can kill the king. And he can take the kingdom for himself. He can take the inheritance and the blessing. And what he does instead is he cuts off a corner of the robe, and even that causes him to be struck in his conscience. And then later on in chapter 26, a deep sleep from the Lord comes upon Saul and all his men. They're in the darkness of sleep. And then David's men go and they can take this pitcher of water from beside the head of the king and his spear, which is the great symbol of Saul he's been associated with since chapter 17. And so you've got these two occasions when Saul and the kingdom is in David's hands. He could have taken it. And then in the context of this, we have all these echoes of the story of Jacob and Esau. We have things like the way that Saul asks, "Is that your voice, David, my son?"
Wow.
We have David being told by Esau that you will have the blessing. And then the text also says that Saul lifted up his voice and wept. That's the description of Esau's reaction to losing his blessing. And in these cases, what we see is David not grasping the blessing when he had the chance. And what he does is instead leave this in God's hand, and then God gives him the blessing. And in the story, we also have these other elements. So, for instance, Jonathan takes his garments and he gives them to David. He's a positive version of Esau. And then later on, when he greets David in chapter 20, he bows his face to the ground, greets him, falls on his neck and kisses him. And this is the description of the meeting between Esau and Jacob in chapter 33 of Genesis. And so we're having all these themes play out. And sometimes it will be in specific episodes, like the story of Michael and the use of goat skin to disguise this teraphim this household idol to let David down through the window so she'll deceive her father-in-law. It's the story of Rachel deceiving Laban. It's the story of Rebecca and using the goat skin to disguise her younger son as the older. And so all of these things suggest to me that there is implicit commentary upon the story of Jacob found not just in chapters 32 and 33 of Genesis, but also in the book of Samuel. And in that book, we see that Jacob should not have taken that blessing for himself through deception. The Lord would have given it to him. And we see that later on, of course, in chapter 32.
Gosh, that is masterful.
There you have it. And so
this is why they pay Alastair the big bucks.
All.
Oh, that is extraordinarily insightful.